Hello and welcome to the Week 4 Supplemental Lecture on Sandra Harding's The. Like a number of our other readings in this section, Harding's actually going to presuppose some of the things discussed in David Bloor's outline of the strong program for the sociology of knowledge. So you may want to look at these two readings in tandem, particularly if you're interested in writing on this topic, but I'll try to outline the concepts that are necessary to understand this piece as we go through it so that it can be read as a standalone piece. So Harding starts off talking about the difficulties of theorizing gender. She thinks that one of the difficulties of doing a feminist analysis of the natural sciences is not just coming from the natural sciences themselves and their resistance to what feminist theorists are trying to do, but from certain inadequacies or incoherences or inconsistencies in the way in which gender itself is normally wielded as a category. This chapter is not going to resolve those issues. It's part of a longer discussion that will take place in a book, but it outlines what some of the issues are that need to be resolved. So she says the difficulty of developing categories of gender that seem to be analytically relevant to an analysis of the natural sciences is hampered by inadequate notions of gender and by dogmatic views about science and its character that she says even feminists are often insufficiently critical of. She says, in other disciplines in the social sciences and the humanities, the need to theorize gender as a category comes up after three other approaches are generally tried. And this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it's something that she notices as a trend in these disciplines. She said the first thing they do is something she calls women worthies. So they trundle around through the history of the canon and they try to find some women who can also be included in the canon who might have been excluded by people who were selecting only for men. And she says, look, this is good as far as it goes, but it tends to capture only extremely privileged women, because sort of by definition, if you are exceptional enough to be female and to have works that are preserved, there's something really, really unusual about you. The second approach she calls the women's contributions approach, and again it only captures contributions from women that are already filtered out because they've been judged as significant by men. And then there's what she calls victimology studies, which gets a little bit outside elite women's strata, but that often looks at women who've been victimized in various ways. It looks at prostitutes or victims of other kinds of oppression. And she says the problem with this approach is that it tends to obscure female agency. So on the one hand, you've got analyses of the very, very elite that captures their agency but not their exceptionalism, and on the other hand, you've got studies of more ordinary women but framed in a way that sort of deprives them of agency. And the category of gender comes up as a response to the limitations of these previous approaches. She says that these approaches also generally seem to be of limited value for the natural sciences, and therefore the whole notion of feminists working in the natural sciences is often rejected as something that doesn't make sense. She says that sometimes there can get some purchase, feminist theory can get some purchase in the area of biology, because it's one of these areas where science does things that seem to touch on everyday experience and where there are demonstrable differences between men and women. So sometimes you can get purchase through examples that are particularly clear-cut, like differences in the ways in which men and women think about reproduction and other bodily topics, that suggest that the biological sciences might be subject to some kind of critique. But it's difficult with current explanations of gender as a category to defend the claim that this should be extended beyond biology, that in fact it's possible to do a feminist analysis of other sciences as well. Then she notes something, and this is something that Bloor talks about in some detail, that there is a tendency to think that we need to look for social causes for irrational behaviors or for things that people do incorrectly. So people are fairly comfortable looking at gender or gender bias or something strange about the social gender relations if you're analyzing something that someone's done wrong. But when you're talking about ideas from science that we currently accept, when you try to start talking about social causes of any sort, let alone gender, you tend to hit a great deal of resistance. And she wants to analyze some of why that is. Bloor talks about it as a general problem as well, not talking about feminism at all, but she's just talking generally about social scientists who want to analyze science and not just scientific error. And she highlights particularly empiricist and positivist natural and social sciences as exceptionally hostile to the category of gender, or may be willing to add gender as sort of one of the variables that's being looked at among many others, but not acknowledging or agreeing that it has any particular importance to critical insight in those disciplines. She says this opposition is particularly strong from the physical sciences because they take themselves to be looking at non-social objects, so they're doing observations with a method that they believe is neutral and value-free, and they're looking at the natural world. What possible relevance could gender have to the study? They're happy for gendered categories to pop up in studies of medieval science, of non-modern science, of sciences that are understood to have poor method, but they themselves in their contemporary activity don't appear to be doing anything or studying in any way that the category of gender would be relevant. And she says this attitude from the sciences themselves is picked up on and carried over into social science and humanities fields that study the sciences. So they pick up and they mimic the attitudes of the sciences themselves. She says, and again this is a point that's very central to Bloor this week, that science is often granted an exceptional status that's not given to any other institutions, and that science itself, in fact, does not give to any other institutions. She says, this kind of social activity alone, we are told, so that's science, scientific activity, must be understood only in terms of its enthusiasts' understanding of their own activities, in terms of the unself-conscious, uncritical interpretations the natives provide of their beliefs and activities. So again, she's using this anthropological vocabulary here. This is something Bloor will do as well. They're trying to say that the scientists are understanding themselves to be speaking only in the light of truth, some kind of objective status, and you can apply anthropological or sociological analyses essentially to primitives, to natives, to people whose belief systems are full of error. But the scientists understand themselves as enlightened, as standing in an objective space, and therefore outside the reach of some kind of sociological analysis of why they believe what they do. People who come out of the tradition that Bloor starts in what's called the Strong program in the sociology of knowledge often take anthropological vocabulary that is often used and directed traditionally to what are regarded as primitive societies, and they deliberately use that vocabulary to talk about extremely modern practices like science and technology. It's a confrontational move, but it's meant to get across that these theorists, these writers, Harding and Bloor and others in this tradition, don't accept the idea that just by dint of being modern we escape the same sorts of social biases and prejudices and shapings of our thought that humans in all social contexts would have. And indeed, they will try to distinguish the question of whether the science is correct in its results from the question of why it occurs to us to look for particular results at a particular time. You can separate out questions of what are called warrant, questions of whether the science accurately matches up to reality, from questions of how the science is carried out, why we're asking the questions we are at a particular time, and other sorts of sociological questions. But there's a deliberate use of anthropological vocabulary that has a certain shock value that's often understood to be something about primitive societies, and to deliberately choose to apply that vocabulary to a very modern aspect of very modern societies. So she says, that is, scientists report their activities, and philosophers and historians of science interpret these reports so that we can rationally account for the growth of scientific knowledge in the very same moral, political, and epistemological terms scientists use to explain their activities to funding sources or science critics. So she views many social scientists and philosophers of science as really uncritical interpreters of the scientists themselves. It would be equivalent to her to going off anthropologically and studying some other society and completely accepting at face value everything you were told. The habit in anthropology is to critically examine the things you're told, and she thinks that perspective can be brought to bear on the sciences as well. Now, like most of the other readings in this category, she points back to Kuhn and talking about his work sparking alternative critical approaches to science that are not so slavishly accepting of the self-understanding of scientists. And she says this work provokes enormous hostility, and the hostility on its face seems sort of strange. It seems to contradict science's self-image as a critical force. If it is such a critical force, if it tears down its own and others' assumptions, why is it so resistant to these critical investigations of scientific practice? And again, she does this anthropological move, and it's meant to be confrontational. It's meant to make science place itself in the framework that is ordinarily reserved for primitive societies. She says, look, this huge hostility that science has really isn't surprising if we think of science's story about itself as a kind of origins myth. She says, as anthropologists tell us, origins myths frequently violate the very categories they generate. In other cultures, they may report that those cultures came into existence through incest, cannibalism, bestiality, sexual unions between gods and mortals, activities subsequently forbidden in those cultures. The origins myth for our scientific culture tells us that we came into existence in part through a kind of critical thought about the social relations between medieval inquiry and society that is subsequently forbidden in our scientific cultures. This is a sort of a mean point here that she's making. If you take an origin myth to contain all sorts of values that are later going to be rejected in the culture, and if you take science's image as hugely critical and hugely self-critical to be an origin myth, to be a story about where it came from, then contemporary practice is going to be the opposite of what's expressed in that myth. So she's saying that you can understand the hostility if you understand these stories that scientists tell themselves to not be about their current practice, but about the origin of the discipline, and current practice is going to be the opposite of that. She says, this is a magical, perhaps even a religious or mystical conception of ideal knowledge-seeking. It excludes itself from the categories and activities it prescribes for everything else. It recommends that we understand everything but science through causal analyses and critical scrutiny of inherited beliefs. Okay, so science exceptionalizes itself out, and again, this is something that Bloor will hit on as well, and there is a desire to cut through that exceptionalization and to analyze science in much the same way that we analyze other human institutions. And then she draws on this piece by Quine, who's an analytic philosopher who makes a sort of a pragmatist turn within analytic philosophy, and he writes a very prominent piece called Two Dogmas of Empiricism that she's going to pick up on to try to criticize empiricist understandings of the sciences and the social sciences that she thinks are hostile to feminism. And in summarizing Quine, she's going to use him to say that his argument shows that epistemologically we can't tell whether we're responding to impulses from our culture, from our language, or from our experience. And that Quine concludes that the only standards that are left when we can't make a clear distinction between language and experience are either pragmatic or behaviorist ones. He's open to both. She's less keen on the behaviorist formulations. So epistemology, as you would know from the common lecture this week, epistemology is about how we know what we know, how we can be certain that we know what we know, or how we understand our knowledge and the relationship of that knowledge to reality. So epistemologically, Quine is saying that it's actually quite a difficult thing, and that ultimately pragmatic or other kinds of less pristine standards are all we have to fall back on. There's no hard and fast way we're going to be able to resolve this in some kind of objective fashion. And she says, we can appreciate the pragmatic tendencies in his thinking without having to agree to his behaviorism, to his program for replacing philosophy with what appears to many theorists as a still far too reductionist and obsessively empiricist social science. So she wants to pick up on the pragmatism, and there's a tradition of pragmatic thought that flows out from this. And she says, in light of this, some strains of feminism still appear too empiricist, and empiricism itself within the social and natural sciences generates a hostility to the very idea of a feminist science critique. And it does this because if you're an empiricist, if you think that knowledge is sort of broadly shaped by and adequate to an empirical world, the idea that you would bring in some qualifier, that it would be feminist or proletarian or some sort of modifier of the kind of science you're doing, looks like you're just putting something in the way of your empirical observation, something that's going to distort it. Okay, she's arguing that there are grounds to think that those sorts of distortions are always already there, and once you recognize that, it makes looking at those distortions through the lens of something like feminist analysis a more reasonable thing to want to do. And then she runs through a series of different sort of arguments or conceptions of science that each have their own hostility toward feminism embedded within them, and she's going to try to take each one apart. She says that there's an assertion of the sacredness of science, and this is related to the thing she was making fun of just above. She says there's a position that human knowledge is decreased if you try to account for science on the same terms that science uses to account for all other human activities. And she thinks this is tantamount to calling science a sacred space that is sort of exempt from all other rules of human interaction. She says this position sets limits on human rationality for what are best thought of as religious or mystical reasons. And there's not a good reason for a form of thought that tries to break everything else down in causal terms, to act like it itself cannot be analyzed in causal terms, that it only exists because of a direct, clear, and objective correspondence between perception and empirical reality. She runs through several examples of potential questions about the social function and impact of science, and says these are all questions that could be investigated empirically. So quite apart from the issue of whether scientific observations are correct or not, you can analyze various things about the impact that science has or is likely to have on the broader society. And she says when you start asking questions like this, you appear blasphemous. You're treated like you're violating a religious precept to the vast majority of both scientists and non-scientists. And she runs through this sort of list of patronizing responses. She says these include raised eyebrows, knowing smiles not directed toward the speaker, or overly hostile glares, responses that are hardly paradigms of rational argument. Those of you who may have been to a conference and delivered a paper may recognize some of these reactions. It sounds like she's possibly not always had the best experience. She says that the arguments are personalized, so rather than being treated as a difficult and challenging analytical question, people blame the question on some bad experience that the questioner might have had. She talks about being accused of hating scientists. So the question isn't dealt with, it's deflected back to the personal characteristics that are presumed to be possessed by the person asking the question. And she says this kind of behavior suggests there's a taboo around science, and again it's the deliberate use of this anthropological terminology that is comparing science to irrational behaviors, to sort of outmoded religious behaviors. She says there's a belief that science is and must remain separate from society, and that the scientific method will eventually shake out and eliminate any kind of social biases that sneak in spite of that separation. But she says the separation does not in fact exist today. Its fetishization, though, lingers on. So there's a worship of the idea, there's a fetishization, again the anthropological language, of the idea that science is separate from society. In fact it's not, she says, but there is a worship of the idea that this is what's meant to happen, and it serves to treat science as a sacred space. The next argument she goes through is the assertion that science has a unique method. So here the issue is not that it is sacred and beyond criticism, but that it's got a method that over time is going to achieve value-free observations, whether the individual scientists are value-free or not. And if you start criticizing this notion, she says, you get questions about, does feminism think the method is sexist? Is some kind of new method required? Are the findings and the laws sexist if you don't like the method? And she says, and this is very similar to Feyerabend, it's unclear how the method of science is unique. Different sciences use different methods, and she doesn't know of a way, and other people will make this same point, to define the scientific method in any way that draws boundaries that are consistent to how the term is understood in practice. And she runs through some examples that's sort of very, very difficult to define a list of methodological precepts that clearly pick out what we think of as science and clearly exclude all the stuff that we don't. Popper's worrying about this when he talks about the demarcation problem. Feyerabend also thinks there's no way to write the method out such that this becomes possible. And then she goes to Popper, And she says, well, Popper doesn't try to define it by a method, but by an attitude, is how she characterizes Popper's argument. And she says that Popper claims that what's distinct about science is that it regards all claims as potentially open to contestation. And she says, look, we've already talked, in talking about the sacred notion of science, about the fact that in fact there are things that you can't contest, that are not really open to discussion. She says, based on the murkiness of what the scientific method would actually be, there's no particular reason to assume that a feminist science would result in any new kind of method. She says, at least if we mean by scientific method no more than one, putting beliefs to the test of experimental observation, which she thinks is historically quite old; two, relying on induction and deduction, again historically quite old; or three, being willing to hold all of our assumptions open to criticism. She doesn't particularly think that science does that now, but would be quite happy for that to be a premise of a method, and she thinks then that feminism could be part of that openness to criticism. Then she talks about physics being held up as the paradigmatic science, as the sort of the highest example of what science is meant to be and the thing to which all other sciences are meant to aspire. And she goes about this a couple of different ways. She's going to both say that physics is sort of hugely atypical, and so there's no particular reason to think that anything else can or indeed should aspire to it. And then she's also going to use a concept from Kuhn, who thinks that paradigms are ways that you organize research along a particular line to make it coherent and to enable it to progress. And Kuhn implies that at some point the things that you can research within a particular paradigm tend to get exhausted, and then things are ripe for replacement with a new paradigm. And she suggests that if we regard current physics, or indeed current forms of science, as paradigmatic, this is implying that at some point they will wear out their usefulness and be ripe for replacement. I'm not myself convinced this is an accurate use of Kuhn's notion of paradigm. He does talk about why shifts between paradigms might happen, but I don't think he's actually made a predictive claim that a paradigm's necessarily going to get exhausted and run aground. And then she talks about the questions that get posed around this. She says feminism is challenged to show that physics is gendered. If physics can't be shown to be gendered since it's the paradigmatic science, then by definition, if any other science is gendered, it's just because it's still sort of half developed and it hasn't reached the state of perfection that physics has reached. She says actually she thinks we should take a different kind of science as our paradigm, and she suggests critical self-reflexive social science as the paradigmatic science, and that we should do this because demonstrably, she says, physics has a less complicated subject matter. This is why it can analyze it as cleanly and smoothly as it can. It can isolate out simpler sorts of variables to deal with. She also says that physics concepts are still dependent on social interpretation and social context, the fact that people are interested in and able to understand physics, that they are open to what it has to say. These are all historically and socially conditioned phenomena. Physics doesn't necessarily, in its own practice, need to consider the impact of self-reflection on its objects, so the objects that it's examining themselves are not going to change their behavior based on some sort of self-reflection or intention or meaning, but this just means it's got a simpler field, and therefore doesn't need to draw on the resources that are necessary for more complex fields. But this is not a reason to think that it is a better science than the science done in more complex fields. She says the sorts of interpretive skills that are deployed in critical and self-reflexive social science are required for a science where we're dealing with meaningful, intentional acts. Okay, so she wants to suggest that we have some grounds based on Kuhn to think that current paradigms will sort of run out of steam, and that there is a paradigm kind of waiting in the wings for critical self-reflexive social science that's ready to step to the fore when that happens. If physics doesn't work, maybe pure mathematics will be harder to deal with. So she says that it comes up as an example of something that's not meant to be amenable to social analysis. Social history may have some impact on external things like why certain mathematical problems get examined or solved at particular periods, but those social influences are not regarded as affecting the mathematical techniques once they've been developed. And so the challenge is, does feminism need to show that mathematical concepts and proofs are sexist? And she says, look, she doesn't accept the premise. There's no such thing as pure mathematics. First, that there's no conceptual system that can provide justification for itself, so mathematics itself has to point outside itself, and increasingly the consensus, she says, is that it has to point to pragmatic grounds, which are social and historical in nature, to justify what it's doing. She also points out that historically there are mathematical concepts that are developed and accepted in particular cultures that are rejected by later ones, and that social imagery is integral to developing new forms of mathematics and making new discoveries. She talks a little bit here about whether you can do a logical justification for mathematics, says that it looks like you cannot, and then also points a little bit at research saying that certain kinds of logical operations seem to be gendered. She says mathematics, and this argument is a bit like the argument she made about physics, mathematics can be useful for examining aspects of the world that won't be too badly distorted by the sorts of simplifications it makes. So mathematics can be applied to particular kinds of low-lying fruit that are simple enough that its tools can make sense of it, but it's not of much use for more complex phenomena. Then she moves to talking about assumptions about gender, and in particular about symmetrical and asymmetrical assumptions about gender. And here she's talking about ideas that are bounced around in feminist theory and in critiques of feminism. She says that there's a strain caused by what she calls partial concepts of gender. Partial concepts either focus on only very small numbers of the ways that gender appears in social life, so they analyze particular manifestations of gender inequality or gender difference, but they don't capture everything holistically, and therefore they can't get a sense of how things combine and reinforce one another in complex ways. Or there's an assumption that there are gender differences in practice and symbolic systems. They may be quite widespread, but they're understood at core to be morally and politically symmetrical. And she'll have in mind in part things like first-wave feminism that often asserted a sort of a distinct female sphere, but she thinks that there are later manifestations of this, that there are masculine and feminine elements to the human, and that what we need to do is incorporate both of these elements more fully into our social ideal for what it means to be human. But there's still a dichotomy at the base of that. We're still dividing things into two. And these partial concepts of gender imply particular strategies. They imply different strategies from one another, and the strategies are also different to the strategies that she herself would prefer. So you get a conflict over what to do based on these different ways of analyzing gender and how it works. And she runs through a few examples where either there is a focus on equity, a focus on outright discrimination, or on numbers of women that hold certain positions, which she says can be partial by not looking at things like the broader division of labor, the difficulty of getting men to move into traditionally female roles, and therefore heightened pressures on women in the division of labor itself. This is the sort of thing that Rose talks about at great detail. She also talks about more textual or symbolic analyses that are critical of the fact that you have ideals of the human that draw on masculine capacities, that try to correct this problem by getting these ideals to draw on feminine capacities too. And she says that this is assuming that there's some kind of underlying dichotomy, that if we could just make it symmetrical, everything would all be good. She believes there's an intrinsic asymmetry where these categories come into play. So then what do? She says that there are conflicting proposals, and again, remembering that this is a chapter in a longer work, she's going to go on and examine these in greater detail. So one proposal says we need to replace the masculine with the feminine voice, we need to reverse the pole of privilege, and we need to gender science in some new way. There's also a position that says you want to seek a feminist rather than a feminine voice, so something that is more critical in its charge, or that you reject the ideal of any single voice as itself androcentric, that you want decentered forms of knowledge seeking. And you have a set of questions. So how do the gender division of labor, the gender symbolism that structures our social interactions and our cultural beliefs, and gendered identity and desire, how do all of these things together function, reinforce each other, sit in tension with each other? How do they operate together? What's the relationship between asymmetrical gender symbolism, sexual order, and sexual identities? And what are the goals of proposed feminist ways of knowing? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? How are you going to get there? And then this sort of very manifesto-like paragraph in conclusion. Feminism argues that there are no contemporary humans who escape gendering. Contrary to traditional belief, men do not. It argues that masculinity, far from being the ideal for members of our species, is at least as far from paradigmatically admirable as it had claimed femininity to be. Feminism also asserts that gender is a fundamental category within which meaning and value are assigned to everything in the world, a way of organizing human social relations. So this is a redefinition of gender. If we regarded science as a totally social activity, we could begin to understand the myriad ways in which it too is structured by expressions of gender. So gender is a pervasive category. If we don't treat science as sacred, but we take it as a social institution among others, we will understand that gender is pervasive there as well. All that stands between us and that project are inadequate theories of gender, the dogmas of empiricism, and a good deal of political struggle. Okay, this is something that we'll come back to when we talk about social movements toward the end of the course.